Hirohito, the Shōwa Emperor and Japan's 20th Century Part 1. The Birth of a Symbol. Hirohito's Early Years. 1901. 1916. On a spring day in the twilight of the Meiji era, April 29, 1901, a child was born into the most sacred lineage of the Japanese nation. This child, named Hirohito, entered the world within the walls of the Aoyama Palace in Tokyo compound, reserved for the highest echelons of the imperial household. He was the firstborn son of Crown Prince Yoshihito and Crown Princess Sadako, later known to history as Emperor Taishō and Empress Taimei. From the moment of his birth, Hirohito was more than just a prince. He was the embodiment of imperial continuity, the living heir to a divine ancestry that, according to Japanese mythology, stretched back more than 2 millennia to the sun goddess Amaterasu herself. Hirohito's arrival occurred during a transformative era in Japan's history. The country was emerging from centuries of feudal isolation into the modern age, guided by the visionary policies of his grandfather, Emperor Meiji. Under Meiji's reign, Japan had undergone a spectacular metamorphosis from a secluded archipelago into an industrialized and militarized world power. Railroads crisscrossed the land, Western-style factories belched smoke into the sky, and modern education systems and military reforms reshaped the social fabric. Hirohito, born into this dynamic and rapidly evolving nation, would spend his early years at the confluence of old-world tradition and new-world ambition. Despite being the eldest son of the crown prince, Hirohito's infancy was characterized by emotional distance. Like other heirs to the chrysanthemum throne before him, he was raised apart from his biological parents. Shortly after birth, he was removed from the care of the crown princess and entrusted to the guardianship of imperial court ladies and aristocratic tutors. This practice was intended to preserve the sanctity of the heir's imperial education, free from the softening influence of maternal affection. It also symbolically reinforced the idea that the emperor, and by extension, the emperor-to-be, belonged not to a family but to the nation. The strict routines of palace life enveloped Hirohito from his earliest memories. As a child, his daily existence was guided by an austere and meticulously curated curriculum. Lessons in Shinto ritual, Confucian ethics, and classical Japanese literature were instilled alongside military drills and Western science. Even playtime was carefully supervised and ideologically framed. Those who surrounded him did so with absolute reverence. They bowed in his presence and avoided eye contact, treating the young boy not as a child, but as a near-divine figure in waiting. This environment, while nurturing obedience and duty, inevitably isolated Hirohito emotionally, forming in him a deep reserve and quiet demeanor that would remain a hallmark of his personality throughout his life. In 1904, as Hirohito entered early childhood, Japan was engaged in a new kind of warone that would define its growing status as a modern empire. The Russo-Japanese War erupted over imperial rivalries in Korea and Manchuria, and to the astonishment of the world, Japan defeated the Russian Empire, marking the first time in modern history that an Asian power had triumphed over a major European one. Though Hirohito was too young to understand its political significance, the war affirmed the legitimacy and potency of the imperial state that he was born to lead. By the time he reached school age, Hirohito was enrolled in the Gakushuin Peers School, an elite academy designed exclusively for the children of the nobility. Here, he studied alongside other aristocrats, although even among them, Hirohito stood apart, addressed with reverence, guarded constantly, and rarely allowed unmonitored interaction. His academic training emphasized history, ethics, the Japanese classics, and foreign languages, including English. He also studied arithmetic, geography, and, notably, natural sciences. It was during these early years that Hirohito developed a deep and abiding interest in marine biology, rare and apolitical passion that would later become one of his few personal escapes from the burdens of his imperial role. In 1912, when Hirohito was just 11 years old, his grandfather Emperor Meiji passed away, ending an era that had redefined Japan. His father Yoshihito ascended the throne, becoming Emperor Taishō. The Meiji era had been one of assertion and transformation. The Taishō era would be more uncertain, marked by instability and the weakening health of the new emperor. With Emperor Taishō plagued by physical and neurological ailments, the imperial household and its advisors increasingly turned to Hirohito as the future anchor of stability and symbolism. In effect, the weight of the imperial system began to shift to his young shoulders. By 1914, as Europe descended into the First World War, Japan aligned itself with the Allied powers, seizing German holdings in East Asia. These global developments, though distant from Hirohito's schoolroom, shaped the geopolitical world into which he would soon step. In 1916, at the age of 15, Hirohito was formally invested as crown prince. The Retaishi no Reia grand court ritual held in Kyoto marked his official designation as heir to the chrysanthemum throne. Surrounded by ancient rites and clad in imperial robes that symbolized unbroken succession, Hirohito emerged from his adolescence no longer as a mere boy, but as the future face of the Japanese nation. The ceremony was a moment of national significance, steeped in imperial grandeur and reinforced by the presence of nobles, generals, and government officials. Though Hirohito remained quiet and inward-looking, his preparation for rulership intensified. Under the mentorship of senior statesmen and scholars, he was further instructed in constitutional law, diplomacy, and the fine art of imperial neutrality, a concept essential to Japan's system of government, in which the emperor was both revered and removed from direct political decision-making. Yet beneath the pageantry, subtle shifts in the world were beginning to shape Hirohito's path. Western influences, rising militarism, and popular demands for political participation would soon challenge the foundations of the imperial system. As the boy emperor in training matured, he would be thrust into the storm of a changing world, one that would test not only the resilience of the empire, but the soul of the man destined to rule it. Part 2. Groomed for the Throne. Education, Discipline, and the Prince Abroad, 1916-1921. Following his formal investiture as Crown Prince in 1916, Hirohito entered the most rigorous and formative period of his early lifetime, in which every aspect of his education, personality, and bearing was shaped in preparation for the throne. Though only 15 years old, he was already being positioned not simply as the future emperor of Japan, but as a symbolic bridge between tradition and modernity, between the imperial mystique and the emerging forces of global diplomacy. His curriculum became more intense, demanding, and ideological. The Crown Prince now studied under private tutors who were among the finest scholars and civil servants of the day. Foremost among them was Count Makino Nobuaki, a diplomat and close advisor to the imperial household. Makino played an essential role in shaping Hirohito's worldview, emphasizing the necessity of restraint, composure, and duty above personal ambition. He taught that the emperor must be an unshakable figure, a source of stability and sacred authority amidst the turmoil of politics. The studies themselves were exhaustive and grueling. Hirohito rose early and adhered to a rigid daily schedule filled with lectures on constitutional law, military organization, world history, economics, and international relations. A special emphasis was placed on Japan's emerging place among the world's great powers. He was taught about the workings of Western democracies and empires, including the British parliamentary system and the balance of power in Europe. He learned not only how to think like a sovereign, but also how to be perceived as one measured, silent, and ceremonially perfect. However, even in the midst of this princely regimen, Hirohito's personal interests were not entirely extinguished. His fascination with marine biology deepened, and he increasingly sought solace in the study of aquatic life. He began to keep meticulous notebooks, illustrating and describing sea creatures with scientific precision. This quiet passion gave him a rare sense of personal agency in a life otherwise dictated by protocol and obligation. It also foreshadowed his future desire to retreat into apolitical pursuits during the most turbulent years of his reign. By 1919, Hirohito was nearing adulthood, and Japan was undergoing significant internal changes. The political atmosphere was shifting. While the emperor remained sacred and above politics, the actual governance of Japan was growing increasingly contentious. Parliamentary democracy was gaining a foothold, but so too were militarist voices who viewed Western liberalism with suspicion and scorn. The ideological battle for Japan's future had begun to simmer, even as Hirohito was still being taught to maintain ceremonial detachment. In this context, an unprecedented decision was made. Hirohito would travel abroad. It was a radical departure from centuries of imperial tradition. No sitting emperor or crown prince of Japan had ever set foot outside the archipelago. Yet in 1921, a global tour was proposed and approved not only as a diplomatic gesture, but also as an opportunity for Hirohito to experience the broader world firsthand. The destination was the British Empire, fellow naval power, a constitutional monarchy, and a nation with which Japan had developed both alliance and rivalry. The significance of this voyage cannot be overstated. At the age of 20, Hirohito embarked on a long journey aboard the battleship Katori, accompanied by an entourage of advisors, naval officers, and interpreters. As the ship crossed the seas, making stops in Hong Kong, Singapore, Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and through the Suez Canal, Hirohito was exposed to the vastness of empire and the diversity of cultures under European rule. He observed colonial administration, port cities teeming with commerce, and the growing tensions between imperial powers and the peoples they governed. But it was in Great Britain that Hirohito experienced the most profound impact. There, he was received not as a distant Asian prince, but as a sovereign-to-be of a rising global power. King George V and the British royal family welcomed him with honor and ceremonial dignity. Hirohito visited military academies, laboratories, universities, and government institutions. He witnessed how a constitutional monarchy could adapt to the modern world, a lesson that may have influenced his later posture as a more restrained, symbolic emperor, despite the militarist tide that would soon engulf his nation. Observers noted Hirohito's reserved demeanor and calm attentiveness. Though he spoke little and wrote less publicly, his internal reflections were keen. In private letters and official reports, his aides remarked on his attentiveness to scientific progress, his fascination with technology, and his curiosity about the British royal court's balance between tradition and public service. He was particularly impressed by the informal yet dignified way the British monarch engaged with his people, a model he would later attempt, though, with great difficulty to emulate. After 6 months abroad, Hirohito returned to Japan in September 1921 to find his homeland still struggling with political volatility and imperial growing pains. The experience had broadened his horizons and added layers to his personal development. No longer just a prince sheltered in the chrysanthemum-walled palaces of Tokyo, he had now seen the wider world and the global expectations placed upon leaders who wore a crown. That same year, tragedy struck. Emperor Taishō, increasingly incapacitated by illness and mental decline, could no longer fulfill his imperial duties. On November 25, 1921, Hirohito was officially appointed as Prince Regent, Taishō, making him the de facto ruler of Japan, though not yet emperor. At only 20 years old, Hirohito now bore the full weight of the imperial institution. It was a quiet, momentous shift, the beginning of a reign that would span the most destructive and transformative decades in Japan's long history. The prince, once cloistered behind the ritual walls of aristocratic upbringing, was now stepping onto the political stage not just as a symbol of national unity, but as a potential fulcrum in a nation teetering between constitutional evolution and militarist regression. How he would navigate this treacherous terrain would soon define the fate of millions and forever alter the legacy of the chrysanthemum throne. Part 3. The Young Regent, Rising Tensions, and Fragile Democracy, 1921-1926. When Hirohito was appointed Prince Regent, Taishō, in November 1921, he did so not through triumph, but through necessity. His father, Emperor Taishō, had descended into increasing mental and physical incapacity, largely hidden from the public eye, and could no longer fulfill his ceremonial or symbolic duties. At just 20 years of age, Hirohito became the acting sovereign of Japan, ushered into the role quietly but with immense consequence. Although his official title did not yet make him emperor, the transition effectively placed the young prince at the helm of a complex and rapidly evolving empire. Japan stood at a critical crossroads. The nation had grown into a modern imperial power, with influence stretching from Korea to the Pacific, but it was also burdened by growing internal dissent, economic hardship, and a fragile parliamentary system that struggled to assert itself against military ambition. As regent, Hirohito was expected to maintain the facade of imperial neutrality while being gently but deliberately introduced to matters of governance. His role was both ceremonial and real. He presided over cabinet meetings, read imperial rescripts, and reviewed matters of state. But at the same time, he was expected to project an image of restrained virtue, untouched by the storms of political dispute. Advisors like Count Makino Nobuaki and General Nara Takeji remained at his side, guiding his decisions and ensuring that protocol was meticulously observed. Behind the curtains of this carefully orchestrated image, however, Japan was a nation in flux. The decade that followed World War I had brought mixed fortunes. On the one hand, Japan's status as a victorious power in the conflict had elevated its international standing. It secured new territorial holdings and was recognized at the Washington Naval Conference of 1921–22 as one of the world's leading naval powers, alongside the United States and Britain. But domestically, the post-war era was tumultuous. The Taishō democracy movement, which advocated for broader participation in government and liberal reforms, was met with fierce resistance from conservative forces in the military and the bureaucracy. While political parties jockeyed for influence in the newly formed Diet Parliament, Japan's military establishment began to resent their diminishing authority and sought new ways to assert national strength through external expansion. Hirohito watched these tensions unfold with quiet intensity. Though still young, he displayed an instinct for balance. He listened attentively to the perspectives of his military advisors but was also intrigued by the constitutional frameworks he had studied during his visit to Britain. Yet, he never openly challenged the rising power of the generals or bureaucrats who surrounded him. His role as regent was constrained by precedent, and any overt act of political will might have been seen as a breach of the sacred imperial aloofness that had long defined the Japanese monarchy. It was during this period, too, that Hirohito's public image was carefully cultivated. He began making ceremonial appearances across the empire, attending military parades, public festivals, and regional tours. Each outing was choreographed to reinforce the perception of a stable and benevolent monarchy. Photographs and newspaper reports emphasized his solemn dignity, his youthful composure, and his dedication to duty. Yet one event in this period would mark him deeply and shape his understanding of the fragility of public life. In December 1923, a Korean independence activist named Daisuke Namba attempted to assassinate the regent during a public procession in Tokyo. Though the attempt failed and Hirohito emerged unharmed, the shock reverberated throughout the nation. The incident was treated not simply as a criminal act, but as a challenge to imperial authority. Namba was executed, and the government used the attack to intensify crackdowns on leftist movements and Korean activists. For Hirohito, the episode was both a personal and symbolic awakening. The imperial aura, long considered inviolable, had been pierced, at least in intent, by a young man who had been radicalized by Japan's own colonial policies. It revealed the deep undercurrents of resentment that ran through the empire and exposed the vulnerabilities of the monarch's public role in an age of ideological conflict. The political atmosphere continued to darken. The economic bubble of the post-war period began to deflate, triggering labor unrest and farmer uprisings. Earthquakes and natural disasters, most notably the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, which killed over 100 people, added to the sense of crisis. Amid the rubble and grief, military and police forces launched pogroms against Koreans and socialists, inflamed by rumors and racial hatred. The Regency issued words of condolence and support, but Hirohito remained largely silent in the face of these injustices, bound by the imperial code to avoid political involvement. In 1924, a significant political development occurred. Under pressure from liberals and reformers, the government passed the General Election Law, which expanded suffrage to all adult males over the age of 25. For the first time, Japan began to resemble a mass participatory democracy. Yet, this same year, the Peace Preservation Law was also passed aimed at suppressing socialist, anarchist, and communist activities. The contradiction was stark. Japan was becoming more democratic on paper, while simultaneously bolstering the instruments of state control and surveillance. Hirohito, as regent, approved both laws without public comment. Historians have long debated whether he did so with tacit endorsement or under pressure from his advisors and ministers. What is clear is that Hirohito learned from these years how the emperor could remain ostensibly above politics while enabling profound shifts in national policy simply by remaining silent. It was a lesson that would haunt the decades to come. In December 1926, Emperor Taishō died, and the regency came to an end. Hirohito, at the age of 25, ascended to the chrysanthemum throne as the 124th Emperor of Japan. His era would be named Shōwa, meaning enlightened peace. But the path ahead would be anything but peaceful. The new emperor stood at a historical precipice. Behind him lay the legacies of modernization, imperial conquest, and fractured democracy. Ahead lay militarism, war, devastation, and eventual rebirth. The man who once stood in awe before the British crown in London was now the sovereign ruler of an empire in turmoilan empire, whose destiny would soon become inextricably tied to his own. Part 4. The Young Emperor and the Winds of Militarism. 1926. 1931. On December 25. 1926. With the death of Emperor Taishō, the imperial mantle passed to his son Hirohito, who became the 124th Emperor of Japan. The nation entered a new era, formally named Shōwa, meaning enlightened peace. Yet, tragically, this name would come to contrast bitterly with the reality of Hirohito's reign, especially in its earliest decades. At just 25 years old, Hirohito inherited more than the chrysanthemum throne. He inherited a nation perched on the edge of ideological upheaval, military ambition, and social unrest. His accession marked the beginning of what would become the longest reign in Japanese history, but it began under darkening skies. While his early role as emperor was bound by tradition and formality, Hirohito was now, in name and image, the divine center of the Japanese state. According to Shinto doctrine and the Meiji Constitution of 1889, the emperor was sacred and inviolable. Though supposedly above politics, his name authorized laws, military appointments, and declarations of war. In reality, power was exercised through advisors, ministers, and generals. Still, the symbolic authority Hirohito wielded gave weight and legitimacy to the state's every action. The new emperor presided over a society facing intense contradictions. On one side stood constitutional politicians trying to uphold the rule of law, democratic elections, and a modern bureaucracy. On the other stood growing factions within the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, who viewed parliamentary politics as corrupt and weak. These military leaders envisioned a new path for Japan, one forged by conquest, racial destiny, and authoritarian governance. Hirohito's first years as emperor were marked by ceremony and caution. He participated in formal audiences, reviewed troops, and delivered imperial rescripts to the Diet. Publicly, he appeared as a serene, dignified figure, the embodiment of national unity. Privately, he continued to study political theory, economics, and international affairs under the guidance of imperial tutors. He was deeply interested in science, especially marine biology, but remained shy and reserved in state matters. At court, his most trusted aides such as Privy Seal Makino Nobuaki and General Sadao Arakish, his worldview. Makino emphasized the need to protect the monarchy's aloofness from political affairs, urging Hirohito to follow the precedent of constitutional monarchy, where ministers bore responsibility. But military men like Araki, influenced by ultranationalist ideology and Bushido ethics, preached a different doctrine: that Japan must seize its destiny as a divine empire, expand its reach into Asia, and restore moral clarity by crushing leftist and liberal elements at home. In 1927, Japan was hit by a severe financial crisis. Several banks collapsed, leading to widespread panic and economic instability. The crisis gave momentum to voices calling for a more interventionist, nationalist agenda. Militarists argued that Japan needed secure access to natural resources: coal, iron, oil, and that these could be found not in its home islands but across the seas, especially in Manchuria, a vast resource-rich region in northeastern China. At the same time, assassinations and political violence began to escalate. The 1928 killing of Zhang Zuolin, a Chinese warlord in Manchuria, by Japanese Kwantung Army officers, occurred without Tokyo's approval but went unpunished. The civilian government, fearful of inflaming tensions with the military, avoided confrontation. Hirohito received reports of the event and was made aware of the military's defiance, but chose to remain silent, avoiding a constitutional crisis. This pattern of passive acquiescence would come to define his early reign. Time and again, Hirohito was informed of aggressive or illegal actions taken by elements of the army, and though he sometimes expressed disapproval in private, he rarely took decisive public action to stop them. His reluctance was driven by a belief in preserving imperial neutrality, but also by a fear of weakening the throne's status or causing internal conflict between army and state. In 1929, the global Great Depression struck Japan with devastating force. Exports collapsed, unemployment surged, and rural regions descended into misery. Desperation fed radicalization. Young military officers formed secret societies, some advocating coups to restore imperial rule by purging the government. The military, more than the Diet or political parties, was seen by many as the only institution capable of reviving national pride and strength. By 1930, Hirohito faced one of his first major constitutional dilemmas: the ratification of the London Naval Treaty. The agreement, signed by the United States, Britain, and Japan, limited naval armaments and was intended to prevent an arms race. While the civilian Prime Minister Ozachi Hamaguchi supported it, the treaty was bitterly opposed by military hardliners who saw it as a humiliating compromise. Hirohito ultimately ratified the treaty over the objections of some generals and admirals, but not without consequence. The backlash was fierce. In 1931, Hamaguchi was shot by a nationalist extremist and would die of his wounds months later. The message was clear: anyone who opposed the path of military expansion did so at great personal risk. Hirohito expressed concern, but again avoided direct political involvement. He chose to defend the monarchy's appearance of unity rather than challenge the forces undermining parliamentary government. His constitutional role allowed him to guide but not openly govern. Whether out of principle or fear or both, he allowed militarist influence to grow unchecked. By 1931, that influence would explode into a full-blown crisis. The Manchurian Incident. Rogue Japanese army officers staged an explosion near the South Manchuria Railway as a pretext for invasion. Without authorization from Tokyo, the Kwantung Army launched a full-scale occupation of Manchuria. The civilian government was stunned. Hirohito was informed of the military's actions. According to some accounts, he expressed misgivings, but again, he approved orders after the fact, legitimizing the occupation. This decision, passive as it was, marked a critical turning point. The emperor had failed to stop a clear breach of military protocol and international law, and in doing so, had signaled that Japan's army could act independently of both government and crown. In retrospect, the early Shōwa years were a slow but steady unraveling of democratic governance in Japan. Hirohito stood at the center of this transformation, neither its chief architect nor its passive observer, but something in between. He watched, advised, approved, and sometimes hesitated. but rarely resisted. In doing so, he lent the imperial aura to a tide of militarism that would soon carry Japan to the edge of catastrophe. Part 5. The Emperor and the Rise of Manchukuo, 1930. 1933. By the autumn of 1931, a new chapter in East Asian history and in Hirohito's imperial reign was being written in the cold plains of Manchuria. On the night of September 18, officers of the Kwantung Army, stationed in the region to protect Japanese interests along the South Manchurian Railway, detonated a small explosive near the tracks outside Mukden, now Shenyang. Although the explosion caused only minor damage and no real threat to the railway, it served as a carefully orchestrated pretext for immediate military occupation. Within days, Japanese forces seized control of key cities throughout southern Manchuria. They acted without prior approval from Tokyo, and certainly without any formal authorization from the civilian government or the emperor himself. This event, which came to be known as the Manchurian Incident, marked a pivotal moment in modern Japanese history. It was a military coup in all but name carried out, not in the imperial capital, but on the fringes of empire. Hirohito was informed of the events in real time. Daily reports from the general staff reached the palace. Though the emperor expressed concerns about the aggressive nature of the army's actions, his responses were largely restrained. He chose not to issue an imperial rescript condemning the Kwantung Army. He did not order their withdrawal. Instead, in the weeks that followed, he tacitly approved the expansion of operations, effectively legitimizing a fait accompli. Historians have debated the extent of Hirohito's involvement. Some argue that he was a constitutional monarch with limited authority to interfere. Others suggest that, given his status in the military command hierarchy, Hirohito could have issued stronger directives to halt the expansion. The truth likely lies between these extremes. Hirohito was aware, cautious, and at times disapproving, but ultimately unwilling to use his imperial prestige to confront the army directly. What followed was an imperial farce cloaked in diplomatic language. In March 1932, with the region firmly under Japanese control, a new state was proclaimed. Manchukuo, the Empire of Manchuria. To lend it an air of legitimacy, the Japanese installed Puyi, the former Qing Emperor of China who had been deposed in 1912, as its nominal ruler. Puyi had been living in exile, reduced to a relic of dynastic memory. His return to a throne, though purely symbolic and tightly controlled by Japanese advisors, was meant to suggest continuity, order, and historical justification for Japan's actions. Hirohito was deeply interested in the matter. He reviewed documents regarding Manchukuo's formation, consulted with his top advisors, and even reviewed the imperial rescripts that would formally acknowledge Japan's friendly relationship with the new regime. In the public eye, the emperor was distant, the aloof figurehead presiding over a new era of expansion. Privately, he was more involved meticulously reviewing the language used in proclamations and keeping track of troop movements. International reaction to the creation of Manchukuo was swift and condemnatory. China denounced it as an invasion and appealed to the League of Nations, which dispatched a commission under British diplomat Lord Lytton to investigate. The resulting Lytton Report, released in October 1932, concluded that Manchukuo was not a legitimate independent state, but a Japanese puppet regime established through force. The League refused to recognize it. The Japanese government, now increasingly under the sway of militarist hardliners, responded by withdrawing from the League of Nations altogether in early 1933, an event that further isolated Japan diplomatically and deepened its commitment to unilateralism. Hirohito did not oppose this withdrawal. Though he reportedly expressed disappointment at Japan's growing isolation, he signed the official imperial documents authorizing the exit from the League. The move symbolized a broader rejection of Western norms and international cooperation. It was a clear step toward the policy of autarky, military dominance, and racial nationalist ideology that would soon define Japan's course. Domestically, the success in Manchuria had profound consequences. The military's triumph emboldened extremist officers, convinced the public that the army alone could restore national pride, and undermined civilian politicians who had failed to prevent economic decline. Assassinations of liberal politicians continued with impunity. The army, flush with victory and untouchable in the public imagination, began to dictate foreign policy and interfere openly in internal governance. For Hirohito, the conquest of Manchuria presented a contradiction. As emperor, he was the highest moral authority in the land. Yet his name had been used to justify an illegal invasion. The troops fought under the imperial standard. The edicts bore his signature. While his personal intentions may have been moderate, his image had become inseparable from the agenda of aggression. His silence, in the face of these developments, whether born of pragmatism, loyalty to the military, or fear of overstepping the constitutional limits of his role only, further strengthened the illusion that the emperor endorsed the military's path. The years following the Manchurian incident marked the effective end of Japan's experiment with parliamentary democracy. Civilian control of the military eroded. Political assassinations multiplied. Japan's press, education system, and civic institutions increasingly adopted the rhetoric of nationalism and imperial destiny. And through it all, Hirohito remained the serene centerpiece of the empire, his face on the coins, his image in every schoolroom, his voice rarely heard but always present in the background. As Japan plunged into the 1930s, it did so beneath banners bearing his name and symbols bearing his crest. The emperor had not set the fire, but he stood by as it spread. Part 6. Shadows of Assassination and the Fall of Civilian Rule. 1933. 1936. As Japan's occupation of Manchuria solidified into the puppet state of Manchukuo, the domestic landscape within Japan itself entered a turbulent and dangerous phase. The early 1930s were a period marked not only by growing aggression abroad, but by political instability and violence at home, as the military's influence over national policy surged, and civilian governments withered under pressure, intimidation, and bloodshed. By 1933, Hirohito stood at the center of a fragile and increasingly fragile political system. The imperial institution, long considered sacred and immutable, was now being used to justify the expansionist ideologies of the militarists. The ideology of the Shōwa Restoration, a term inspired by the earlier Meiji Restoration, gained traction among radical officers. These extremists believed they were rescuing the emperor from corrupt politicians and industrialists, and they framed their violent acts as demonstrations of loyalty to Hirohito's sacred person. In this context, assassination became a political tool. Prominent figures associated with the moderate or democratic order were targeted. In May 1932, Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi was assassinated in his own residence by naval officers in what came to be known as the May 15 incident. Though this assassination technically occurred before Manchukuo was proclaimed, its repercussions echoed through the subsequent years. The assassins, when tried, were given light sentences and treated as heroes by sections of the public. This failure to punish treason emboldened a new generation of radicals. In the wake of these murderers, Hirohito found himself increasingly dependent on the military, not merely as the defender of the realm, but as the force that now dictated the terms of government. While he still formally appointed prime ministers, his choices became increasingly constrained. Civilian politicians no longer dared to challenge military directives, and military leaders began to act independently of any oversight. Hirohito's role became more complex and ambiguous. On one hand, he continued to meet regularly with ministers, generals, and admirals, carefully reading reports and occasionally raising objections. He reviewed key legislation and military orders. On the other hand, he rarely used his imperial prerogative to resist the encroachments of the army, fearing that doing so would trigger greater unrest or even civil conflict. Some historians argue that his caution stemmed from a desire to protect the imperial institution by staying above politics. Others see in it a complicity born of silence. The tension came to a head in February 1936 with one of the most shocking incidents of pre-war Japan, the February 26 incident. In the early hours of that day, a group of around 400 young army officers launched a coup attempt in Tokyo, seeking to purge the government of evil advisors and restore direct imperial rule. They murdered several high-ranking officials, including Finance Minister Takahashi Korekiyo and former Prime Minister Saito Makoto, and occupied key government buildings. The rebels believed they were acting in accordance with the emperor's will. They even sent messages to the imperial palace requesting that Hirohito endorse their actions and approve a new cabinet that would remove all opponents of the military. But in this instance, Hirohito responded with rare, decisive force. Furious that his authority was being misused to justify insubordination, he rejected the demands outright. Reports indicate that he shouted at his military aides, declaring, "Are you suggesting that an army mutiny should be rewarded? I will not allow these rebels to trample on the dignity of the imperial household." He ordered the coup to be suppressed and gave his approval for the army to act swiftly. The rebellion was crushed within 3 days, and several of the ringleaders were executed. This moment has been seen by some as a clear assertion of Hirohito's authority. For once, he had refused to tolerate extremism in his name, but the cost of this confrontation was paradoxical. Although the rebellion failed, it pushed Japan even further into the hands of the military establishment. The generals who crushed the coup were not liberals or constitutionalists. They were hardliners committed to imperial expansion. With the moderates now even more thoroughly discredited or dead, Japan's descent into total militarization accelerated. Following the incident, Hirohito no longer resisted the increasingly aggressive foreign policy moves being planned by the general staff. He approved further troop deployments in northern China. As tensions between Japan and the Chinese nationalist government worsened, the idea of a vast East Asian bloc dominated by Japan, the so-called Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, began to take shape, although its rhetoric of cooperation masked a brutal vision of domination. Meanwhile, indoctrination within Japanese society deepened. Schools taught children that the emperor was a living god and that loyalty to him required ultimate sacrifice. Newspapers and literature promoted martial values, self-discipline, and reverence for the national mission. The emperor's image attached yet omnipresent permeated daily life, both as a spiritual guide and as a symbol of national unity. By the mid-1930s, Hirohito had become the sovereign of a state in which democratic processes were no longer viable, and in which all roads military, ideological, and bureaucratical to war. The throne he occupied was revered, but no longer guarded by the checks and balances of civilian rule. Whether out of caution, belief in hierarchy, or a conviction that destiny demanded Japan's greatness, the emperor stood as the silent fulcrum of a regime teetering toward global conflict. Part 7. The Emperor at War. The Road to Nanjing and Beyond. 1930. 7. 1938. By 1937, the slow boil of Japanese militarism reached a violent crescendo. The emperor, who had once hesitated to approve the occupation of Manchuria, now found himself sovereign over a nation spiraling toward a continental war. In this new phase, Hirohito's position would no longer allow for mere observance. He became the symbolic and constitutional centerpiece of Japan's total war effort. The flashpoint came in July 1937 at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing. A skirmish between Japanese and Chinese troops quickly escalated into open hostilities. While some within the Japanese high command hoped to contain the conflict, hardliners, particularly within the Kwantung Army, pushed for full-scale invasion. Civilian leaders such as Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro were effectively powerless to check military momentum, and by the end of July, Japan was in the midst of what would become known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. Hirohito was fully briefed on the campaign. He received daily reports, approved military orders, and continued to preside over imperial conferences, where Japan's highest political and military figures gathered to formulate national policy. Though later post-war narratives often attempted to portray Hirohito as a remote, aloof figurehead, evidence suggests he took an active interest in military affairs. He reviewed battle maps, asked detailed questions, and even commented on troop deployments and strategy. According to records from his aides, He was particularly focused on weather reports and terrain data, which could impact campaign timing details a disengaged monarch would likely not have pursued. But it was the rape of Nanjing, which began in December 1937, that would mark the darkest moment of the early war years. After the Japanese army captured the nationalist capital of Nanjing, they unleashed a horrific 6-week massacre. Historians estimate that between 200, 0 to 300, 0 civilians and prisoners of war were slaughtered, and tens of thousands of women were raped. Entire families were destroyed, and the city turned into a charnel house of unrestrained brutality. The question of Hirohito's responsibility has haunted historical debate for decades. While no document explicitly shows him ordering the atrocities, his command responsibility as head of the armed forces is undeniable. Japanese field commanders were technically subordinate to him, and the army operated under imperial rescripts. The emperor was informed of the campaign's progress and had the authority to discipline offending officers. Yet, no public denunciation came from the throne, and no general involved in the massacre was dismissed or even reprimanded at the time. Some historians suggest Hirohito may have received sanitized reports and that his advisors shielded him from the worst details. Others argue that, even if fully informed, Hirohito chose silence to maintain unity and protect the imperial institution from scandal. The truth likely lies in the murky space between knowledge, passivity, and willful omission. Either way, Hirohito presided over a military machine that now operated with near impunity and believed itself to be enacting the emperor's will. Domestically, the war was accompanied by a new wave of mobilization. In 1938, the National Mobilization Law was passed, giving the government sweeping powers to control industry, labor, the press, and the economy. Censorship was tightened, and any dissent was branded as treasonous. Schools and media promoted the ideals of sacrifice, racial superiority, and loyalty to the emperor. The Kokutai ideology, which presented the emperor as the living embodiment of the state, reached its most rigid form. Hirohito remained both visible and revered. He made public appearances, inspected military units, and was portrayed in newspapers as a divine figure leading Japan to glory. Photographs and portraits of the emperor hung in every school and government office. Children were taught to bow before his image and to be prepared to die in his name. While Hirohito never publicly called for such fervor, neither did he discourage it. The cult of the emperor was now deeply entwined with Japan's war machine. Internationally, Japan faced growing condemnation. Reports of atrocities began to reach Western audiences, particularly after the attack on the USS Panay, an American gunboat, by Japanese aircraft on the Yangtze River in December 1937. Though Tokyo issued an apology and paid compensation, distrust of Japan was mounting, particularly in the United States, which began to impose economic sanctions and arms embargoes. Still, within Japan, Hirohito's popularity remained high. The myth of a benevolent, divinely inspired monarch remained intact. The Japanese people, many of them unaware of the full scale of the army's brutality in China, continued to revere their emperor as the moral anchor of a righteous war. Dissent was rare, and where it appeared, it was swiftly crushed by the special hire police. By the end of 1938, Japan had seized vast swaths of Chinese territory, but victory remained elusive. The Chinese nationalists, under Chiang Kai-shek, refused to surrender, and guerrilla warfare began to take a brutal toll. Meanwhile, the costs of war were mounting, and Japan's resources were being stretched thin. Yet, Hirohito continued to support the conflict, believing like many of his advisors that Japan's destiny as a great power required dominance over East Asia. Thus, as war raged in China and the drums of a wider conflict began to sound, Emperor Hirohito stood not only as a symbol but as a key enabler of Japan's wartime trajectory. In the years ahead, this trajectory would expand far beyond the Asian mainland and plunge the world into its deadliest war yet. Part 8. Toward a Greater East Asia. Hirohito and the Path to Pearl Harbor. 1939, 1941. As the conflict in China dragged on with no clear resolution in sight, Japan's imperial ambitions became ever more expansive. The concept of a self-sufficient regional bloc, free from Western influence, took firmer shape. Dubbed the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, this vision promised economic unity and liberation from colonial rule, but in practice, it became a cover for aggressive imperial conquest under Japanese dominance. And at the center of this vision, still cloaked in sacred mystique, stood Emperor Hirohito. By 1939, Japan was entrenched in a war of attrition in China, bleeding resources and morale. Though major cities had fallen under Japanese control, the Chinese resistance remained fierce, bolstered by Soviet aid and domestic support for Chiang Kai-shek's government. Meanwhile, Europe was descending into war. With Germany's invasion of Poland and the outbreak of World War II, Japan saw a shifting world order filled with both opportunity and peril. In September 1940, Japan took a decisive step. It signed the Tripartite Pact with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, forming the Axis powers. This formal alliance was motivated by strategic pragmatism. Germany had stunned the world with its victories in Western Europe, and Japan hoped to benefit by joining forces with a seemingly unstoppable power. Yet, this move further isolated Tokyo from Western democracies, especially the United States, which viewed the Axis with mounting alarm. The same month, Japan deployed troops to northern French Indochina, modern-day Vietnam, leveraging France's weakened position under German occupation. This strategic move allowed Japan to cut off supply routes to Chinese nationalists and gain a critical foothold in Southeast Asia. Hirohito was fully briefed on the plan and gave his imperial sanction. Once again, he played the role of constitutional commander-in-chief, reviewing proposals and formally approving military action through imperial rescripts. But this move triggered a sharp reaction from Washington. The United States, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, began imposing increasingly severe economic sanctions on Japan, particularly targeting vital materials such as oil, steel, and rubber. In July 1941, after Japan moved further into southern Indochina, the U.S. froze Japanese assets and placed an oil embargo, a devastating blow for a nation that imported more than 80% of its oil. For Japanese planners, this amounted to an existential crisis. Without oil, the war in China would falter, and the Navy would grind to a halt. Diplomacy was pursued in parallel with military planning. Hirohito, in private, expressed a preference for resolving tensions through negotiation. He met with Foreign Minister Yosuke Matsuoka and other advisors to explore possibilities, but time was running out. The military, particularly the Imperial Japanese Navy, pressed for a bold strike to break the deadlock. Meanwhile, a new prime minister had risen to power. General Hideki Tojo, a staunch militarist with little patience for compromise. Though he was formally subordinate to the emperor, Tojo exercised vast influence over government and military affairs. Still, Hirohito retained ultimate authority. He received briefings, questioned military proposals, and even delayed decisions, most notably in November 1941, when he asked for further diplomatic efforts with the U.S. Yet the pressure of events was unrelenting. The Imperial Conference of November 5, 1941, brought together Japan's top civilian and military leaders, and Hirohito was present as the supreme authority. There, the course of war was sealed. While some argued for a final diplomatic push, the consensus tilted toward military action unless the U.S. lifted its embargo, a concession Roosevelt was unwilling to grant. In early December, Hirohito gave his imperial sanction to Japan's war plan. The Navy would strike the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, while Japanese forces simultaneously attacked British and Dutch colonies across Southeast Asia. On December 8, 1941, December 7 in Hawaii, Japan launched its surprise attack, crippling the American fleet and triggering U.S. entry into World War II. In a rare public address, Hirohito declared war on the United States and Britain, issuing a rescript that cast Japan's actions as a noble struggle for self-defense and liberation from Western oppression. The people of Japan, conditioned for years by imperial ideology and wartime propaganda, received his words with reverence and resolve. The war that Hirohito had now openly sanctioned would soon engulf half the globe. Over the next few months, Japan scored stunning victories capturing the Philippines, Malaya, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. The emperor was kept constantly informed, his court bustling with military reports and updates. He took a personal interest in battle outcomes, weather conditions, and strategic planning. His handwritten notations and queries on war briefings reveal an engaged and methodical mind. Yet even in these early triumphs, cracks began to show. Japan had awakened a formidable enemy in the United States, whose industrial and military capacity would far outmatch the island nations in the long run. Still, in 1941 and early 1942, Hirohito presided over a vast empire stretching from Manchuria to New Guinean emperor, now at the helm of the most far-reaching war in Japan's history. The illusion of invincibility, however, would not last long. Soon, the tide of war would begin to turn, and Hirohito would face the gravest test of his reign not in victory, but in defeat. Part 9. A Nation in Ruins. Hirohito, in the Aftermath of Defeat. 1945. 1946. The end of World War II did not simply bring peace to Japan, it brought devastation, humiliation, and an existential crisis. In the final months of the war and the immediate aftermath of Japan's surrender, Emperor Hirohito faced perhaps the most turbulent and emotionally charged period of his life. For a man revered as a living deity by millions, the shock of presiding over an utterly defeated and devastated nation proved both humbling and transformative. When Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, via a recorded radio address known as the Gyokuan Hosohi's, voice reached the ears of ordinary citizens for the first time. The carefully worded speech, delivered in formal court language few fully understood, did not explicitly use the word surrender. Still, its message was unmistakable. Japan had been defeated. The emperor, long the embodiment of national strength and spiritual purity, now spoke with the tone of a mournful father, urging his people to endure the unendurable. The broadcast sent shockwaves through the empire. Some responded with grief, others with numb disbelief. For many military officers, the loss of honor was too great to bear. Several committed suicide in ritual defiance. In the days following the surrender, Hirohito's role became deeply ambiguous. While he remained Japan's emperor, his political and symbolic authority had been fundamentally shattered. Tokyo lay in ruins from relentless bombing raids. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, recently destroyed by atomic bombs, stood as dark omens of the new atomic age. Millions were homeless, food supplies were collapsing, and the Imperial Army, seemingly unstoppable, was in full retreat and disarmament. Meanwhile, U.S. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Japan to oversee the Allied occupation, establishing supreme command for the Allied powers, SCAP, to begin reshaping the nation. One of the first and most pressing issues facing both SCAP and Japanese leadership was the fate of Hirohito himself. Calls for his prosecution as a war criminal echoed from the United States, the Soviet Union, and other Allied nations. Within Japan, there was confusion. While some clung to their reverence for the emperor, others whispered doubts. Had he been a helpless figurehead manipulated by the military? Or had he been a willing architect of aggression and suffering? MacArthur, however, took a pragmatic view. He concluded that preserving Hirohito's symbolic presence could ensure stability, ease the burdens of occupation, and prevent communist unrest. In private meetings between the emperor and MacArthur, beginning with a famous photograph of the two men, in which Hirohito appeared diminutive beside the towering American general, the groundwork was laid for a new relationship. Hirohito reportedly offered to accept responsibility for the war and even expressed willingness to face punishment if it would shield the Japanese people. MacArthur refused to allow his trial, seeing more benefit in reforming Japan with Hirohito as a constitutional monarch. As the occupation began in earnest, Hirohito took a historic step that would redefine the monarchy's role. On January 1, 1946, in his Ningen Sengentha Humanity Declaration, he renounced the claim of divine descent. No longer would the Japanese emperor be seen as a living god. The language of the declaration, drafted in cooperation with the occupation authorities, was deliberately ambiguous, but the message was unprecedented. The mystique of imperial divinity had been a cornerstone of the Japanese state for centuries. Now, under the shadow of defeat and under foreign supervision, Hirohito himself dismantled that idea. The emotional and spiritual weight of this renunciation was immense. For Hirohito, who had been raised from childhood in the belief of his sacred role, it was a disorienting rupture. Yet he accepted it with composure. In the eyes of many Japanese citizens, his act did not strip him of respect. Instead, it humanized him. He became, paradoxically, more relatably an emperor who had suffered alongside his people, endured loss, and now sought peace. This period also marked the beginning of his transformation from wartime ruler to post-war symbol of reconciliation. As Japan's cities were rebuilt and its institutions restructured under democratic reforms, Hirohito assumed a quieter, more symbolic role. He would no longer direct policy, issue commands, or serve as a rallying point for conquest. Instead, he would become a figure of unity, a living reminder of continuity amidst radical change. Yet, beneath the calm surface, difficult questions remained. Was Hirohito truly unaware of the military's most brutal atrocities? Had he opposed the war behind closed doors, or merely managed it with cold detachment? These debates would simmer for decades, with historians continuing to examine and re-examine evidence from wartime records, testimonies, and memoirs. But in the fragile dawn of the post-war era, Hirohito's survival was a calculated necessity. And as Japan began the arduous journey from scorched ruins to global economic recovery, the emperor, stripped of godhood but still cloaked in tradition, remained at the heart of the national story. Part 10. From God to Man, the Emperor's Post-War Transformation, 1946, 1948. The years following Japan's surrender and the issuance of the Ningen Sengentha Emperor's declaration of his human status were a profound turning point in both Hirohito's personal journey and in Japan's transformation. The very foundations of the Japanese imperial institution were being dismantled or redefined under American occupation, and Hirohito found himself navigating a completely new world, one in which his authority no longer held the weight of divinity, nor the power to command. In the spring of 1946, Hirohito began an extraordinary undertaking that no emperor before him had done. He traveled throughout Japan to meet with ordinary citizens. These tours were unprecedented. Accompanied by Empress Nagako and a retinue of officials, Hirohito visited war-torn cities, rural villages, schools, factories, and disaster-stricken areas. He spoke with children, shook hands with farmers, and offered words of sympathy and encouragement to those who had lost everything in the war. These encounters humanized the emperor in the eyes of the Japanese people in a way that divine reverence never could. The frail but determined figure in Western civilian clothes no longer seemed like a distant deity, but rather a humbled national symbol striving to share the burdens of a shattered society. These imperial tours were carefully staged and encouraged by the occupation authorities, particularly by General Douglas MacArthur's administration, as a means of restoring morale and bolstering national unity. By presenting Hirohito as a constitutional monarch committed to peace, SCAP hoped to ensure the success of the sweeping reforms they were imposing on Japan. The old Japan with its militaristic state ideology, secret police, and emperor worship was being systematically dismantled. In its place, a democratic Japan was being shaped, with Hirohito as its benign figurehead. One of the most important developments in this transformation was the creation of the 1947 Constitution of Japan, known as the post-war Constitution, or the MacArthur Constitution. Hirohito played a ceremonial role in endorsing the new document, but the real power now shifted decisively to the elected parliament and prime minister. The emperor was explicitly defined as the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, with no governing power. This was a monumental change. For the first time in Japanese history, the emperor became a passive institution rather than the active embodiment of sovereign authority. The language of the constitution was clear and decisive. Article 1 stated, "The emperor shall be the symbol of the state and of the unity of the people, deriving his position from the will of the people with whom resides sovereign power." The reverberations of this change were immense. For centuries, Japan's rulers, whether real or symbolic, had drawn their legitimacy from lineage, not from the will of the people. Now, Hirohito's legitimacy was anchored not in mythic ancestry, but in democracy. Though he had been trained his entire life to uphold imperial dignity and distance, Hirohito now had to adapt to being a figure of modern national identity, accessible and bound by the new rules of a pacifist constitutional order. Simultaneously, behind the public image of reform and reconciliation, debates about Hirohito's wartime culpability continued to intensify both inside and outside Japan. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, convened in Tokyo in 1946, put leading Japanese generals, admirals, and civilian officials on trial for war crimes. Figures like Hideki Tojo were condemned for their roles in orchestrating aggressive war, atrocities in China, and the mistreatment of prisoners of war. But Hirohito was never brought to trial. General MacArthur and his advisors calculated that prosecuting the emperor could incite unrest, jeopardize the occupation's success, and destroy the fragile unity of a defeated and traumatized people. To prevent such a crisis, SCAP ensured that Hirohito was not named as a defendant. In fact, testimony and legal arguments during the trials were deliberately structured to shield the emperor from blame, even as evidence emerged that suggested he had been informed of many wartime policies. This selective prosecution was controversial and remains so to this day. Still, Hirohito understood the stakes. He cooperated with MacArthur's team, including giving carefully worded statements and promoting the new democratic order. In private, he was described as cooperative, intellectual, and reserved, often expressing concern over the suffering of his people. Yet he also maintained a notable silence about some of the war's darkest episodes, perhaps out of fear, guilt, or the weight of imperial detachment. By 1948, as the occupation entered a new phase and the trials concluded with executions and life sentences for key military and political leaders, Hirohito's transformation from imperial sovereign to constitutional symbol was essentially complete. He remained in his palace, continuing imperial rituals in a private capacity, but now without power. He had become a paradox, the emperor of Japan who had overseen war and peace, divine rule and democratic rebirth, catastrophe and reconstructional in a single lifetime. Hirohito's ability to adapt, to survive amid the ruins of empire, and to reimagine his role was both a testament to his intellect and a product of historical circumstance. The emperor who had once stood at the heart of a militarist state was now a figure of national resilience, his past obscured by the necessities of the present. Part 11. The Road to Recovery. Hirohito in a Reborn Japan, 1940. 1956. As the 1950s dawned, Japan found itself on a road of transformation as profound as it was improbable. From the ashes of imperial defeat, the nation was slowly rebuilding, economically, politically, and socially. At the heart of this rebirth stood Emperor Hirohito, a man whose power had been stripped, whose divinity had been renounced, but who remained a central symbol of Japanese identity. In the emerging order of post-war democracy, Hirohito was no longer a ruler, but he was still, unmistakably, the emperor. After 1948, following the conclusion of the Tokyo war crimes trials, Hirohito's position settled into an ambiguous stability. He was not prosecuted for war crimes, nor was he universally absolved. The Japanese public, exhausted by war, hungry for peace, and now immersed in reconstruction, largely accepted his continued presence, partly out of cultural reverence and partly due to the careful orchestration of American occupation policy. To many Japanese, Hirohito's survival offered a comforting sense of continuity amid drastic change. During this period, Hirohito continued his now frequent public appearances, a hallmark of his post-war life. He attended school ceremonies, agricultural fairs, industrial exhibitions, and diplomatic functions, often dressed in a Western-style morning suit and top hat. These appearances were more than symbolic. They helped bridge the generational and emotional gap between a defeated nation and its imperial legacy. By appearing as a human, a grandfatherly figure rather than an aloof deity, Hirohito provided a form of cultural reassurance that democracy and imperial tradition could coexist. One of the most important moments of his evolving role occurred in 1951, when Japan and the Allied powers signed the Treaty of San Francisco, formally ending the state of war and restoring Japanese sovereignty. Although Hirohito was not involved in the negotiation of the treaty, its terms had a direct impact on his status. The treaty reaffirmed the legitimacy of the Japanese government and constitution, which defined the emperor's role as purely symbolic. It was a quiet victory for Hirohito's strategy of survival, remaining on the throne without stirring controversy or provoking confrontation. That same year, the occupation under General MacArthur ended, and Japan re-entered the international community. In 1952, the American-led occupation officially concluded, and Japan once again governed itself independently. This was a moment of intense national pride and reflection. While Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida and other political leaders were the architects of diplomacy and recovery, Hirohito played his part as the enduring face of a now peaceful Japan. He embraced his symbolic role with diligence. In 1953, Hirohito represented Japan on the world stage for the first time since the war by sending a formal delegation to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Though he did not attend in person, the gesture was significant. It signaled Japan's return as a respected member of the international community. More quietly, Hirohito also began corresponding with foreign dignitaries and academics, often using his personal interest in marine biology as a diplomatic bridge. Indeed, it was during this period that Hirohito increasingly turned to science no merely as a hobby, but as a central component of his personal identity. He dedicated long hours to the study of marine life, publishing academic papers on hydrozoans, medusae, and other invertebrates under his own name. For the public, this scholarly interest gave Hirohito an image of peaceful introspection and intellectual curiosity. For Hirohito himself, it may have been a refuge from the burden of guilt and the complexities of his past. At the same time, the emperor's private life was undergoing change. His children, particularly Crown Prince Akihito, were being raised not as divine heirs, but as citizens of a democratic Japan. The imperial family adopted a more modest public image. Gone were the ceremonies cloaked in esoteric mystery and isolation. In their place came press-friendly photographs of the emperor walking in gardens, visiting disaster victims, or watching baseball games. This humanized portrayal helped repair the public's relationship with the throne. Nonetheless, Hirohito could not fully escape his past. In the early 1950s, intellectuals, journalists, and international observers continued to question his wartime role. Some in Japan criticized the cult of silence around the emperor's accountability. But the Japanese government and the broader population had little appetite for reopening wartime wounds. The nation was focused on economic recovery, and Hirohito's symbolic stability was part of that recovery narrative. By 1956, Japan had joined the United Nations, and its economy was showing the first signs of what would become a meteoric rise. Hirohito, though aging and increasingly a figure of routine and ritual, had successfully transitioned into a modern monarch. His ability to adapt quietly but resolutely enabled him to remain central in a society that was now oriented toward peace, productivity, and integration into the post-war global order. The road from imperial god-king to constitutional monarch had been anything but simple. Yet Hirohito had walked it with a calm and disciplined resilience. In the eyes of many Japanese, he was now not just a survivor of war, but a witness to national rebirth. Part 12. The Miracle Years. Hirohito and Japan's Economic Rise. 1950. 7. 1964. As Japan moved into the late 1950s and early 1960s, it underwent one of the most remarkable transformations in modern history. The shattered, impoverished nation that had surrendered unconditionally just over a decade earlier had begun to emerge as a rising economic power. The term Japanese economic miracle soon entered the global lexicon, and although Emperor Hirohito no longer held political power, he continued to be an ever-present figure, symbolizing continuity through upheaval and Japan's reinvention. By 1957, Japan's industrial output had surpassed pre-war levels, and the economy was growing rapidly. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, and later Hayato Ikeda, the country began to experience unprecedented growth. Investment in infrastructure, education, and technology created a booming middle class and a burgeoning consumer economy. This extraordinary rebound, built on manufacturing exports, innovation, and labor discipline, coincided with a shift in the imperial role from post-war humility to cautious celebration. Hirohito watched these developments with quiet pride and scientific curiosity. He continued his daily routines of research in marine biology, producing scholarly works from the biological laboratory of the imperial palace. This focus on peaceful pursuits subtly rebranded the emperor's public image, contrasting starkly with his militaristic associations during the war years. He was increasingly viewed as a benign, scholarly patriarch who had borne witness to Japan's greatest traumas and was now guiding it gently through an era of prosperity. Throughout this period, Hirohito also played an important ceremonial role in promoting Japan's new national identity. He attended a growing number of public events, including factory openings, university commencements, and cultural festivals that showcased the modern, peaceful, and globally minded Japan. His presence, excellent, dignified, and respectful, carried great symbolic power. These appearances reinforced the idea that the emperor was not a ruler but a unifying figure above politics, representing the soul of the nation. A particularly significant moment came in 1959, when Crown Prince Akihito married a commoner, Michiko Shodate, first time in modern imperial history that a non-aristocratic bride entered the royal family. The marriage was a clear break from centuries of rigid imperial tradition, and it reflected the democratizing spirit of post-war Japan. Hirohito, though initially hesitant about the departure from aristocratic norms, ultimately supported the union, recognizing its importance for the monarchy's future relevance. The public response was overwhelmingly positive. Millions followed the courtship and wedding with fascination, and the imperial family's image grew even more relatable and modern in the eyes of ordinary Japanese citizens. Meanwhile, Japan's international standing continued to rise. In 1960, a new U.S.-Japan Security Treaty was signed, securing Japan's position as a key American ally during the Cold War. Massive public protests erupted against the treaty, revealing deep ambivalence within Japanese society about militarism and sovereignty. While Hirohito remained officially neutral, his calm presence again helped project national stability. He continued to avoid any overt political commentary, leaving controversial matters to elected leaders while embodying national dignity. By 1964, Japan was ready to present its transformation to the world. The Summer Olympics were held in Tokyo, first time the Games had ever been hosted in Asia. It was a landmark moment, symbolizing Japan's recovery, modernity, and reintegration into the global community. The Olympic Games served as a sort of national catharsis. Sleek bullet trains sped visitors across the country, High-tech stadiums and infrastructure showcased Japanese engineering prowess, and the smiling faces of athletes and children replaced the grim images of war. Though Hirohito did not deliver the keynote address, he attended the opening ceremony, his presence emblematic of Japan's peaceful rebirth. To the international press, the emperor appeared increasingly as a quiet, grandfatherly figure, distant from his wartime image. He smiled more openly in photographs, spoke a little more in public, and continued his lifelong marine studies. His personal interests, modest habits, and adherence to routine now seemed not like aloofness, but like a symbol of Japan's cultural continuity and humility. Even his daily walks through the palace gardens and meticulous attention to scientific detail seemed to reinforce the impression of a monarch who had chosen to evolve with his nation rather than resist its transformation. Privately, however, Hirohito was not immune to reflection. Friends and courtiers noted that he remained emotionally reserved, never directly acknowledging his feelings about the war. But in his journals and behind closed doors, there were signs of a man who bore the weight of history and memory, even if he seldom expressed it outwardly. By the mid-1960s, Emperor Hirohito had become a fixed point in the Japanese consciousness, no longer the living god of the empire, nor the distant symbol of surrender, but a steady and familiar figure in an era of stunning progress. He had adapted, endured, and, in his own way, contributed to Japan's rise from ruins. Part 13. Navigating Turbulence, Student Revolts, Political Shifts, and the Shōwa Emperor in the Age of Change, 1965–1974. As Japan surged forward into the late 1960s and early 1970s, the very success of its economic miracle began to generate new strains within society. Prosperity came with consequences: urban overcrowding, environmental degradation, rising inequality, and a growing sense among Japan's youth that the older generation had sacrificed values for materialism. It was a time of rapid modernization and, with it, mounting tensions. In this charged climate, Emperor Hirohito once again found himself walking a delicate path, not as a ruler, but as the nation's symbolic center in a time of ideological and generational upheaval. By 1965, Japan had fully emerged as a major industrial power. Its GDP was rising at one of the fastest rates in the world, and corporations like Sony, Toyota, and Mitsubishi were expanding onto the global stage. While government and business leaders celebrated this success, many younger Japanese began to feel alienated. Inspired by global movements in Europe and the United States, students staged protests against Japan's perceived subservience to the United States, rampant capitalism, and the lack of transparency in government. The university system, the media, and the political establishment all came under intense scrutiny. The most visible manifestation of this unrest came in the form of massive student protests during the late 1960s. Demonstrations erupted on college campuses like the University of Tokyo and Kyoto University. Clashes with riot police became regular occurrences, and in some instances, violent factions such as the Japanese Red Army emerged, engaging in radical and even terrorist activity. Although Hirohito had no constitutional power to intervene, his presence absence during these crises continued to carry weight. Through carefully orchestrated appearances and subtle public statements, he projected an image of calm above the fray. In 1970, a particularly dramatic event revealed the complexity of Japan's cultural and political evolution. Yukio Mishima, one of the country's most celebrated writers and a staunch imperialist, stormed the headquarters of the self-defense forces in Tokyo, demanding the restoration of the emperor's traditional powers. After delivering a fiery speech decrying modern Japan's loss of samurai spirit and reverence for the imperial institution, he committed ritual suicide seppuku before a stunned nation. Hirohito reportedly reacted with cool detachment. The gesture was not only disturbing, but, in the emperor's eyes, misguided. For a man who had presided over the most radical transformation of the imperial office, Mishima's act seemed like a ghostly echo of a past Japan he had already left behind. Meanwhile, the emperor continued his scientific work, publishing further research on hydrozoans and marine invertebrates. His quiet persistence in the biological sciences served as both a personal escape and a symbol of his redefined role. In contrast to the fiery rhetoric of radical protesters or the bureaucratic stoicism of post-war politicians, Hirohito represented continuity, restraint, and the soft power of tradition. At the same time, his apparent detachment from social unrest also fueled criticism among a younger generation who saw him as emblematic of a conformist past. The early 1970s also brought Hirohito into contact with major international leaders. In 1971, he made headlines when he traveled to Europe, marking the first time a Japanese emperor had ever left the country. The visit was groundbreaking. In Britain, he met Queen Elizabeth II, despite lingering resentment over wartime atrocities. Protests were held during his visit, but Hirohito's composure and quiet dignity helped diffuse tensions. His European tour symbolized not just reconciliation, but also Japan's arrival as a full member of the post-war international order. That same year, U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Japan and reaffirmed the U.S.-Japan alliance. These moments were carefully choreographed to reflect the emperor's new status, not as a head of government, but as a living symbol of Japanese identity in a globalized world. At home, Hirohito continued to receive both reverence and scrutiny. Some citizens still lined the streets during his appearances, bowing respectfully as his motorcade passed. Others viewed him with ambivalence, respectful of his symbolic role but uncertain of his wartime legacy. The Japanese press largely shielded him from criticism, but the growing availability of foreign media and literature meant that questions about his role in World War II began to resurface among intellectuals and historians. In 1972, Japan normalized diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, severing ties with Taiwan. While this shift was primarily orchestrated by the Japanese government under Prime Minister Kakuei Tanaka, it represented another major milestone in Japan's post-war reintegration. Hirohito's role in the process was entirely ceremonial, but significant nonetheless. His quiet acceptance of the new alignment underscored his willingness to move forward even when it required breaking with imperial legacies, such as the pre-war support for Chiang Kai-shek. As the 1970s progressed, Hirohito's advancing age and long tenure began to evoke a new sentiment among the Japanese people. He was no longer simply the sovereign of post-war rehabilitation or economic miracle, but a living bridge between two profoundly different Japans: the imperialist empire of the early 20th century and the pacifist, capitalist democracy of the present. His transformation from a militaristic symbol to a subdued constitutional figurehead had, by now, become deeply rooted in the collective memory of a changing nation. Despite political turbulence and cultural clashes, Hirohito endured with a quiet resilience. While he neither wielded power nor led movements, he embodied the subtle force of tradition, adapting to time. As Japan entered the mid-1970s, it was no longer a nation reborn, it was a nation redefining itself, and Hirohito, the aging emperor scientist, stood at its heart. Part 14. The Aging Symbol, Reflection, Reconciliation, and the Reckoning of History. 1975, 1984. As Emperor Hirohito entered the final decade of his long reign, Japan had transformed into one of the most advanced and prosperous nations in the world. From the ashes of defeat, it had risen to become an economic superpower, a democratic ally of the West, and a cultural exporter in its own right. Yet the man who had reigned through this extraordinary century of upheaval and reinvention remained a figure of intense ambiguity, between reverence and controversy, between tradition and modernity. Hirohito was both present and elusive, a man whose past increasingly collided with a new generation's search for historical truth. The late 1970s were a time of growing introspection for the Japanese public. The generation that had rebuilt the country was aging, and those born after the war began to ask deeper questions about their national identity. The economic miracle had brought abundance, but also ennui. As environmental problems, labor unrest, and political scandals crept into the headlines, so too did renewed discussions about Japan's wartime legacy and with them, uncomfortable questions about the emperor's role during that time. During this period, Hirohito maintained a highly controlled public image. His schedule was filled with ceremonial functions, opening national diet sessions, attending commemorations, hosting foreign dignitaries and visits around the country. His appearance remained upright and formal, with his now iconic rimless glasses and reserved expression embodying continuity. But behind the polished protocol, pressure was mounting for greater historical accountability. The rise of a more assertive and independent Japanese press, coupled with increased access to international scholarship, led to a slow but undeniable reevaluation of the emperor's wartime actions. Hirohito, for his part, remained cautious and guarded. He never directly addressed his role in World War II. The official narrative maintained by the Imperial Household Agency and post-war governments portrayed him as a passive monarch, misled by militarist advisors. But archival discoveries and testimony from former military and political figures complicated that narrative. Books and documentaries, particularly from abroad, began to explore the possibility that Hirohito had not been merely a figurehead, but an active participant in decision-making during the 1930s and early 1940s. The Japanese government continued to protect Hirohito from legal or political repercussions. Unlike Germany's reckoning with Hitler's regime, Japan never held a comprehensive public tribunal on the role of the emperor. General MacArthur's post-war decision to shield Hirohito from prosecution ensured his survival, but also created a long shadow that would linger across generations. The emperor's continued silence, while in keeping with his traditional reserve, did little to dispel the perception that he was avoiding responsibility. Amid these debates, Hirohito continued to pursue his lifelong passion for marine biology. He remained an active researcher, contributing to several scientific journals well into his 80s. His studies focused on hydrozoanthony, delicate organisms often overlooked by others. In many ways, this quiet, methodical work symbolized his preferred role in post-war Japan. Meticulous, apolitical, and removed from human conflict. To some, it was an admirable retreat into peaceful study. To others, it was an evasion of more pressing moral responsibilities. Diplomatically, Hirohito continued to make historic visits abroad. One of the most notable came in 1975, when he became the first Japanese emperor to visit the United States. Meeting with President Gerald Ford in Washington, D.C., Hirohito walked through Arlington National Cemetery and laid a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. For American veterans and families of the war dead, the visit evoked mixed emotions. Some viewed it as a gesture of reconciliation, while others considered it an affront, given the unresolved trauma of the Pacific War. Nonetheless, Hirohito's calm demeanor and restrained humility helped foster a tone of healing, however incomplete. In the domestic realm, Hirohito remained distant from political affairs, yet his symbolic presence shaped important moments. The 1,978 enshrinement of Class A war criminals, including Hideki Tojo, at Yasukuni Shrine stirred controversy. Though the emperor did not publicly comment, he stopped visiting the shrine after that year, a decision interpreted by some scholars as a subtle but significant protest. This silent rebuke was only confirmed decades later when it was revealed that Hirohito had expressed personal dismay over the enshrinement in internal imperial records. Public attitudes toward the emperor continued to evolve. While many Japanese still regarded him with respect, especially the older generation who had known only one monarch in their lifetime, younger citizens increasingly saw him as a relic of the past. School textbooks began to include more nuanced depictions of wartime history, and the cult-like reverence that had once surrounded the throne gave way to a more measured, secular view of the monarchy. Yet, Hirohito's longevity and disciplined neutrality had a stabilizing effect on the institution of the emperor. he had not reclaimed his former divine status, but he had preserved the monarchy itself through turbulent decades. In 1984, as the emperor celebrated his 60th year as crown prince and his 58th year on the throne, the imperial household agency orchestrated a series of events to honor his service. Despite his increasingly frail health, Hirohito participated with dignified determination. A special scientific volume was published in his honor, showcasing his lifetime of research. In speeches delivered by others in his name, the themes were consistent: peace, continuity, service. The image of Hirohito as the scholar emperor, detached from politics and devoted to public duty, had become firmly institutionalized. But beneath the surface, the reckoning with the past had not disappeared. Across Asia, especially in China, Korea, and Southeast Asia, Hirohito remained a deeply controversial figure. His legacy as emperor during Japan's military aggression and colonial rule was not easily separated from his post-war persona. While Japan had rebuilt, apologized, and rebranded, its neighbors often viewed Hirohito's unbroken reign as evidence of unresolved historical wounds. As the end of his life approached, Hirohito found himself increasingly isolated from the ideological battles raging beyond the palace gates. Yet, in a paradox that defined his entire existence, his presence remained indispensable to Japan's evolving identity. The emperor who had once stood atop a divine military empire was now a symbol of peace in a democratic nation and a mirror reflecting the unresolved tensions between memory, guilt, pride, and transformation. Part 15. Twilight and Legacy. The Final Years and the Judgment of History. 1985. 1989. As Emperor Hirohito entered the final stretch of his reign, he did so as a monarch whose presence had come to represent continuity more than command, reflection more than resolution. The Japan of the late 1980s bore little resemblance to the militarist empire of the early 20th century over which he had once presided. Technologically advanced, economically dominant, and diplomatically re-engaged, Japan had redefined itself as a peaceful democracy. And yet, the emperor who remained on the throne, frail, deliberate, and enigmatic, carried with him the unresolved contradictions of an extraordinary century. By 1985, Hirohito was 84 years old. The once vigorous emperor now moved with greater caution. His public appearances shortened, and his speech deliveries handled by aides or pre-recorded messages. Still, his presence at state events remained an important symbol. On his birthday that year, he gave a rare statement expressing concern over the loss of historical memory in the younger generation. In it, he urged Japanese youth not to forget the experiences of the pasta, carefully worded remark that many interpreted as a subtle encouragement to reflect on the tragedy of war, even if he did not directly mention Japan's role in it. The mid-1980s also marked a time of renewed controversy over how Japan remembered its wartime past. Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone's 1985 visit to Yasukuni Shrine, where 14 Class A war criminals were enshrined, sparked protests both domestically and internationally. China and South Korea condemned the act, and it reignited debates over whether Japan had done enough to apologize and account for its imperialist aggression. Hirohito did not speak publicly on the issue, in keeping with imperial tradition, but palace sources later revealed that he had continued his refusal to visit Yasukuni Shrine since the enshrinement of war criminals in 1978. This silent stance offered one of the only glimpses into his personal disapproval on a matter of political and moral weight. During this time, Hirohito increasingly became a figure of global fascination. He was the last reigning monarch to have met with both Franklin D. Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler, the last living head of state who had ruled during the cataclysm of World War II. Documentaries, biographies, and academic studies of his life proliferated across the world. Some portrayed him as a benevolent constitutional monarch, trapped by circumstance. Others depicted him as a shrewd and complicit figure, deeply involved in imperial decision-making. These opposing narratives clashed in Japan and abroad, and Hirohito still silent remained at the center of a complex, often painful debate. On the personal front, the emperor faced growing health challenges. By 1986, he was suffering from chronic digestive issues and fatigue. Still, he pushed forward with ceremonial duties, including hosting dignitaries such as U.S. President Ronald Reagan and Queen Elizabeth II. These meetings, rich in symbolism, represented the full circle of Japan's global reintegration. The man who had once led a nation at war with the West now stood as its ceremonial partner and emblem of peace and stability. But even as Hirohito aged, Japan continued to wrestle with his legacy. In 1988, controversy erupted when a U.S. exhibit on World War II included photographs of victims of Japanese atrocities alongside images of the emperor. The Japanese government lodged a protest, claiming the display was disrespectful. The backlash, however, underscored a deepening international divide over Hirohito's place in history. For many in East Asia, especially in countries that had suffered under Japanese occupation, he remained a symbol of unacknowledged imperial crimes. For many in Japan, he was the embodiment of post-war recovery and restraint. Neither image told the whole story, but both were rooted in reality. Hirohito's health took a dramatic downturn in the spring of 1988. Diagnosed with duodenal cancer, he was hospitalized in the fall and underwent emergency surgery. The Japanese media, bound by the sensitivity of covering the emperor's health, issued carefully controlled updates, while the nation entered a kind of hushed vigil. Rumors swirled, temples held prayers, and television stations altered programming out of respect. On January 7, 1989, Emperor Hirohito died at the age of 87. His death marked the end of the Shōwa era, a reign of 62 years, the longest in Japan's history, and one of the longest recorded of any monarch in the world. The country plunged into deep mourning. Flags were lowered, newspapers printed commemorative issues, and millions of Japanese paused to reflect on a man who had been their sovereign for generations. The funeral, held on February 24, 1989, was a vast, solemn affair that brought together global dignitaries and rekindled diplomatic tensions. Leaders from around the world attended, including representatives from countries that had once been bitter enemies. Notably absent, however, were delegations from China and South Korea nations, where memories of Japanese imperialism remained raw and where Hirohito was still associated with aggression and suffering. In the years following his death, Hirohito's legacy has remained deeply contested. His successor, Emperor Akihito, took steps to express sorrow and empathy for the victims of Japan's wartime actions, often visiting former battlefields and expressing condolences in ways his father had never done. Scholars have continued to debate Hirohito's wartime role, analyzing declassified documents and oral histories to piece together the truth of his reign. Today, Hirohito is remembered in two dominant and conflicting ways. Within Japan, he is often seen as the father of the modern nation, a restrained and diligent monarch who presided over unprecedented transformation. Outside Japan, particularly in East and Southeast Asia, he is remembered as the emperor under whose name vast suffering occurred, and whose silence denied closure to countless victims. Ultimately, Hirohito's life reflects the complexity of modern history. He was a man born as a living god, who became a constitutional symbol. He was the head of a brutal imperial regime, and also the father of a peaceful democracy. He embodied contradiction, ambiguity, and transformation, and in that, perhaps, he was the most modern emperor of them all.